I'll be the first to admit that winter light is hard to beat, but getting out with my camera during the winter isn't the easiest for me. I just don't think that I'm particularly cut out for the cold. Especially here in the UK, winters are normally pretty cold, pretty wet, and pretty miserable. Oh my word, I am so wet. My gear is so wet. Pretty grim out there at the moment. We have had torrential hail. We've had torrential rain. I don't know if it's the inevitable lull after the beauty of autumn that can demotivate us as photographers, but this year I've made a real effort to try and get out with my camera more often during the winter to try and make the most of my photography. And in this video, I'm going to share some tips and some things that I've come to realise that have really helped me get better photos during the winter. So we had some wintry weather earlier this week, and I decided to try and make the most of it by just going for a bit of an explore locally down some of the country lanes. I took my Lumix S5 II with the 20 to 60mm kit lens, and I thought today I'll share the tips, but also share some photos and talk you through some compositions and some things that caught my eye whilst I was out with the camera. Now, after the vibrance of autumn, winter can seem very bleak, very colourless, especially if you like to photograph the outdoors and landscapes. Trees are bare, there's no foliage, the fields, the landscape is very barren, but we can still inject some colour and some life into our photos. If you enjoy colour photography, then a great tip is to start messing around with split toning and colour grading. Split toning is a really powerful tool during the winter because a lot of the scenes that we photograph are going to be quite colourless, but if you can start injecting some colour into the shadows, into the midtones, into the highlights, then you can really start to elevate and emphasise the feeling of winter by just adding some cooler tones into some of these parts of the image, just to help emphasize that feeling of cold, of bleakness, and to evoke the feeling of winter. With editing software being so powerful now, we don't need to just rely on what is presented to us in the field. We can start to use split toning as a creative tool to help express the feeling that we want to convey in our images. This scene is a good example of how effective split toning can be. Now, the thing that caught my eye initially was this telegraph pole, which is reflected in the water on the road. Because the snow has started to melt, there's a lot of standing water in the country lanes in this area. You've got the snow-capped hills in the distance, and you've got the low angle of the sun, which is just creating some nice golden light. And that's where the split toning can really help emphasize that. So I've added some oranges into the highlights, and I've added some blues and some aquas into the shadows and midtones respectively, because that creates firstly a really nice color contrast between blue and orange, but also having those cooler tones in the shadows really just gives that sense and that feeling of winter. And whilst this photo may not be anything special, if I do notice subtle details within the landscape, like the symmetry caused by the reflection of the telegraph pole in the standing water, I'll always take the photo, because it's always good to practice the art of seeing and of noticing, and just having an opportunity to take the photo. It's just a good practice tool, and it's a good exercise to get into the habit of doing as often as you can. The other option we have when it comes to colour is to just lean into the bleakness. I think there really is a beauty in the bleakness of winter, and it can be really impactful to certain images if we try to emphasise that bleakness. The best way to combat this lack of colour in the landscape is to edit in black and white. That is something that I do all the time in the winter, and I think it yields great results. And it's especially impactful if you're photographing a subject that has a very contrasty form, or if there is very good light to work with in that scene. This next scene is a good example of how we can use a black and white edit to really create some drama and some interest in an otherwise very colourless scene. So I stumbled across this field with these very characterful oak trees that, again, as I mentioned in the last clip, are just very synonymous with the landscape around here. And the thing that I really liked about this scene initially was firstly the form of the trees. Because they are so bare and without that foliage, it creates really nice contrast against the very white, snow-filled sky. And really what drew my eye to this scene and why I saw potential in this scene is because there was a real opportunity to create some nice separation between the trees. You can see how there's some nice recession in the image, you know, from the tree closest to the lens all the way back to the trees on the far hedgerow. And you've also got other details in this image that kind of show the man-made impact of, you know, this very barren landscape. You've got the farm buildings in the background, and you have this telegraph pole which is kind of nestled between the two oak trees, which again creates a nice sense of contrast, but it's more of a contrast in subject matter as opposed to a visual contrast in terms of exposure. And because of the quality of the light, you know, you've got quite bright skies and you have quite silhouetted trees, but you also have side light which is illuminating the sides of the tree trunks. That's why I chose to edit this photo in black and white, and I feel like it renders the scene really nicely. If we compare that to the color version, again, I still think this scene works quite well because I have again introduced some nice split toning into this particular image. I've added some oranges into the highlights, which you can see along the side of the tree trunks to emphasize the side light from the sun, but I've tried to inject those cooler tones into the greens of the field and into the blue tones of the distant snowy hills. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, one of the best things about winter, in my opinion, is the quality of the light. You just can't beat it, and especially here in the UK, from around December and January onwards, the sun never really gets very high in the sky, and because of that, the sun and the light just seem softer, and you get that golden hour feeling for longer portions of the day. You no longer have to wait for, you know, the brief window at sunrise and sunset. Golden hour seemingly gets stretched out longer, and that gives us a real opportunity to work with light and to make light an important part of our images. As I mentioned in the last point about shooting black and white, if you do have days where there is nice light but you don't have a lot of color in, you know, the landscape, then shooting in black and white to really kind of capture that light and to create that nice contrast, I think makes very, very pleasing images. And a final thing to mention about light is that it can actually saturate the colours that are present in a given scene. Now, a final thing to mention when it comes to colour during the winter is if you're not able to find colour in the natural landscape, I always enjoy shooting subjects that have maybe artificial colour. This is when things like street photography can be great during the winter, or just selecting to photograph subjects that have pops of colour. And these are often very man-made things, but they help inject some of that vibrance back into the scenes, and that can create a nice contrast in itself. If you have a very striking pop of colour against a somewhat bleak backdrop, that can create quite a striking image. I definitely feel like this winter has been one of my best winters photographically so far, and I'm just really excited for what's to come because I'm just getting out with my camera more often and I'm just adopting these ideas and these concepts into my images, and I'm really happy with the results. So I thought today just sharing them with you guys might give you some things to think about if you typically struggle with photographing the outdoors in winter. So if you enjoyed this video or if you found it helpful, do make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, do consider hitting the subscribe button and ringing the bell so you get notified of when new videos come out, which is every single week on a Wednesday. And I hope to see you in the next one.